Hello, we're talking to Lyndal Pascoe today. It's on Monday, the 27th of August. My name is Tamara Keating. Lyndal Pascoe was one of our secretaries and student committee members in 1953, and she raised funds to help with the creation of International House. She's also a council member from 71 to 86 and has done many other things towards International House. Welcome, Lyndal. How are you today?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Tamara.
So I'll start with some really easy ones. Where did you grow up?
In Melbourne,
In Melbourne. And where did you go to high school?
at Melbourne Girls Grammar.
And did you enjoy that?
Yes, very much.
And would it a big school then, or just a little one?
Oh, not huge. I suppose one of the bigger in Melbourne, but was not a huge school.
Perfect. And you studied your Bachelor of Arts and finished in 1954. What interests you in the Bachelor of Arts?
If I can just explain that I've got a BA. I was always interested in languages and history, and quite late in my school years, actually, I decided I'd like to do teaching. And the way to teaching then was to do an undergraduate degree, which I did arts, so we got the BA, and then a year of DBed. Now I think they do Bachelor of Education. I don't think DBed exists.
It does, but thank you very. And tell me about your career path. What schools did you work in?
Only two, really. Our high school, new high school that was started down at Mentone, and then for most of my teaching life I was at Strathcona, which is in the Melbourne suburbs.
Perfect. And you were the secretary in the Students' Committee in 1953 and in the fair to raise funds for International House. How did you get involved in that?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that, and the answer is I really can't remember. I wasn't on the SRC, but I did have quite a lot of friends on the SRC. I had quite a lot of friends amongst the law faculty, and they were fairly heavily involved in the fair eventually. And I thought it was a good cause. But I can't honestly remember
who got you
quite
involved?
how I got so involved.
I know that you bought me the program for the Axillary fair.
Yes, well, for the fair. But my involvement was as in the first fair, there were three money-raising fairs at the university, 1952, 53 and 54. And I was student secretary for the 1952 3 fair and general secretary for 1954. So with the big fair was the market fair of 1953. And the women of the university were heavily involved in that. And with these fairs, we were asked, the students were asked to do what was called fun of the fair, and the women organised stalls as fundraising. I don't know whether people are aware of quite how we came upon these fairs to raise money, because there weren't many overseas students in Melbourne University at that stage, and we really didn't see very many people around who were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, as they say. But in my first year at university was 1951, and the year before, the government had set up Colombo Plan scholarships to bring in students mostly from Southeast Asia. And by the time I started at university, it was becoming obvious that there was a real problem with accommodation. And so they, but there was not only the university administration that was recognising this, but also there were a number of influential businessmen and politicians who could see the problem for lack of accommodation. And at school, at university, there was a group of 3 students who all stand out in the history of International House, and that was Sam Dimmick, and who was on the SRC and they had I don't know whether they still have, a housing officer. And so Sam was meeting these students. They were coming in and saying, we can't find anywhere to live. And so there was Sam, there was Sunda, Rajaratnam, he was called Sunda for short. He was from Singapore doing a med degree. And Ad Jarath, who was from India, and he was doing an architecture degree. And they were involved and succeeded in involving Sam and persuading him what a problem there was. And it's a well-known story that Sam took some of the Asian students and some Australian students down to his holiday house, well, his family holiday house at Sorrento. And Sam suggested they go into Portsea and have a drink at the hotel, commonly known as the Portsea Pub. And so when they got there, Sam was absolutely horrified to find that he wasn't barred, the Australian students weren't barred, but the Asian ones were. And the manager said, oh, my patrons, wouldn't come here if they thought it was full of Asians. And this was the first time, I think, that Sam had met such blatant racial discrimination. And as I say, he was horrified. And those 3, Sam, Sunda and Abjaraf, went on to, Sam, of course, finished up as president of and warden of the house. So this growing awareness in the community of the growing number of students from Southeast Asia coming in and the lack of accommodation, it was becoming obvious inside and outside the university. And so that's where this idea of having fairs at the university and trying to, as far as the students were concerned, trying to involve as many of the students as possible. Well, now, of course, university now, you just couldn't do it now because I think the population of students at Melbourne in the early 50s was about 11,000, but now I don't know how many.
That's just under 60,000.
Yes, very different. And the other thing that worries me really is that the students are not on campus so much of the time. They can access their lecture notes from home or wherever. And of course, they've all got part-time jobs. But, I mean, so it wasn't an easy job to bring the student body together, but actually it was quite amazing in the end, the participation that we got from them. And if you wanted me to just go through a few of the...
That would be great.
The students' fun of the fair things. It went from Friday afternoon and all Saturday, the fair. And there was a reading down the possibilities of things that, one could go to. An Indian exhibition by the Australian Overseas Club. The Janet Clark Hall girls did the program selling. The Historical Society has a coconut shy. I don't know whether they thought that was a good idea. On the Sunday, of course, there was a huge cleaning up to be done, and the students of Newman and Queen's colleges cleaned up on the Sunday. Classics department had fortune telling. The Mountaineering Club shimmied up and down the chemistry building at intervals during the fair, telling people how it could be done. The Society for Psychical Research, I didn't actually know that we had one, but not surprisingly, what did they have? What they called it, a telepathic tent. That's right. The architecture faculty or the architecture school did the signs, and you can see from those involved that it really was remarkably broad number of students and that agreed to do something. The greatest money-raising effort by a student or students was Barry Humphrey's Dada art exhibition, which was he was designed to shock, and he certainly achieved that, but it happened to earn the most money of any of the other activities. I've got a few memories. Well, this is the University Gazette of May 1953, and are you interested in hearing a few of the stalls?
It would be lovely, yeah.
What have we got? The Mad Hatter's stall of sale of homemade and women's hats, antiques and bric-a-brac, hardware and household gadgets. That was convened by Mr. Hosking of the Engineering School for the University Staff Association. Menswear stall, it says here, Mrs. A.V. Jackson. Arty Crafty stall, picker box from the International House Association. That was going then. Flower and garden stall, helped by the staff of the Floristry School. And there's a nice sort of summing up that if I read it, when it says, "This much is certain, that the 1953 International Market Fair had been an unqualified success, a miracle of organisation and community effort on the part of all concerned, and a never-to-be-forgotten university occasion."
Now, that's a wonderful summary.
Yes, it was a pretty good summing up. I liked the one that the law students ran mock trials at intervals all through the fair, and the Vice-Chancellor, who was George Payton, allowed himself to be pulled in, and he was put in the dock and handed a book to on which to swear, and he examined it closely and found that it wasn't a Bible, it was a book of an aspect of the law he had written about. And so he said dryly, "I'm glad to see it's the authorised version you've got here." And that brought everybody to their knees. But, and we had a money yes, no, it wasn't money raising. We persuaded the city council to let us have one lunchtime a parade of cars from the university down to the city of Melbourne through the city at lunchtime. And we were actually amazed at the number of students who turned up in cars, not swish new cars, but there were vintage and veteran cars, and there were some that were just jolly old. But anyway, we all took off. I was with a friend in a 1929 Chevy, and we inched our way downtown. Actually, we had to avoid some cars that had pulled over with their radiators boiling because they'd affixed the advertising sign for the fair right across the radiator. So they were sitting there boiling. But we stopped at an intersection and there was a crowd of people waiting to go across and looking at our procession. And a man came across from the crowd and said, "You're doing a great job. I'm right behind you." And it turned out to be Sir John Latham, who had been Vice-Chancellor of the, Sir John Medley, had been Vice-Chancellor of the university until 51, I think. So that was nice to be recognised in that way. But so I really, as I say, there are so many memories, but you can't. My memory of things 65 years later is not exactly crystal clear.
So the impact of that fair was not just financial, was it?
No.
It was about the awareness of the needs of the international students and accommodation.
Yes, well...
Do you think it achieved its goal by the end of it?
Yes, but it wasn't just... Well, I think you were saying this, that in the beginning there was really a twofold purpose for the house. It was to provide accommodation and for overseas students, but also Australian students. And those students were mostly from Southeast Asia. But then there was also the idea of a 50-50 split between Australian and overseas students, with the idea that it'd foster an international outlook in young people and be a melting pot of cultures. And I think it succeeded excellently in that.
But not just at International House itself, but the whole university probably changed its mindset based on those fairs and your groups doing that awareness.
Yes, I think you're right.
So there was 3 fairs. Was the other 2 as successful or as large?
The first one, 52, wasn't nearly as large. The market fair in 53 was the one that the biggest one. And that was, as I say, well, it was really the women who organised that. And in 54, the women stepped back, and it was mainly organised by the students themselves, and that's when I was secretary of that. Actually, I was thinking the other day, or remembering, that an example of how the university got behind us with the fairs and raising money. I was doing dip ed at that stage, and we had, through the year, we had teaching rounds at various Melbourne schools, and I was due for a teaching round just as the organisation of these of the 54 fair was becoming, the fair was becoming very close, and there was a lot to do. And the education faculty arranged for me to do my teaching round at Melbourne University High, which of course is just across Royal Parade. And that was absolutely wonderful. I mean, I could have been sent, and did during the year. I did a teaching round at Macrob, at Essendon High, um, but this was perfect because I could do my teaching during the day and then hightail it over Royal Parade to get on with the organisation of the fair.
Oh, that was good of the faculty, wasn't it? And so you then became very involved in the Women Auxiliary after these fairs, or during the
Yes.
same time?
Yes, no, the auxiliaries didn't form until after the fairs, really. They it was after the fairs that some of these groups of women, wonderful women they were, decided that they'd be quite happy to go on raising money for the house. And this is when the name of Mavis Jackson comes in. That sort of Mavis is synonymous with the house. And she'd... Oh yes, she'd run a menswear stall with friends in the 53 Market Fair, and everybody in those days, a lot of people in those days, did sew their own clothes, and this was the idea that her friends would sew articles of men's clothing to be for sale. And unfortunately, one of her sewer friends, one of Mavis's sewer friends, was too... they were very enthusiastic, I think, and when it came to sewing up men's boxer underpants, one of the sewers sewed up the fly, and then at that stage, in those days, Sir Bernard Rank was Melbourne's leading plastic surgeon, and his wife was helping Mavis. And Sir Bernard held up the offending pants and said to Mavis, "It appears that one of your seamstresses has a lack of knowledge of the human anatomy." So those pants were quickly put to one
I was going
side.
to say, they wouldn't have sold for a lot, would they?
No, no.
And so what is a woman's auxiliary? Explain what that term means.
Oh, well, yes, I don't know who in the end decided on the name, but what it was a combination of the women who came together for the fairs, and stayed on. They formed groups, and they stayed on to raise funds for the house. And there were the individual auxiliaries. They were what were they? The law group, the medical wives. There was a Dandenong group and an Ivanhoe group. And I haven't mentioned in the fairs the Refreshment Group.
No.
Which, I mean, the job of providing food almost continuously through the fairs was no easy task. And Gwen Stall and her army of helpers formed what became known as the Refreshment Group, and they stayed on after the fair and became a catering group in their own right, and they catered for all sorts of functions. The Union building, of course, the theatre in the Union, but the Victorian Symphony Orchestra, I know they did, and a number of. They just went on and on, and I think it was they finally had to abandon their work in not till 1971, I think it was, or 72, and by which time they'd earned, I think it was nearly £75,000.
Wow.
They were really incredible. But these women, I'd done quite a lot of charity work, as it was called then, as I was growing up, and I hadn't met anything like these women. I mean, I was nearer their children ages, of course, than their ages, but yes. When I'm saying about how I found them, Mavis. Well, I'd come across Mavis at the 53 fair, and 1956, I was newly married, and the phone went one day, and it was Mrs. Jackson. Of course, there was no way I was calling her Mavis in those days. Mrs. Jackson. Wondering if I would be secretary of the Central Committee of the Auxiliaries. And Mavis was very hard to say no to, actually, and so from not having a full-time job at all at that stage, I was doing some tutoring, I suddenly became secretary to this whirlwind of a woman. But they were all, quite incredible in their dedication, and they'd put their hand to anything. The cardinal sin was to waste money on expenses, which, when you run those sort of money-raising things, sometimes the expenses end up to be more than the
event itself, isn't it?
Events, yes. If they could make it or do it themselves, they would. If they get it donated, that'd be wonderful. But as I say, there mustn't be waste. And they did turn their hands to practically anything. And in the Mavis organised them to make the curtains and bedspreads for the first intake of students, which was into Clooney's Ross, of course, wing. And 5 years later, at the AGM, the various members of the various auxiliaries turned up, and there on the table was 90 sets of cut-out curtains and bedspreads to be made up for the entrance of the second lot of students into Wadham the following year.
What impact do you think these first women's committee made towards creating or making International House a reality?
Well, as I say, I think they made a huge impact. I mean, other fundraising and donations were being sought and obtained from outside, but it was the women who soldiered on year after year, until they were all grandmothers, and some of them were great-grandmothers, I think. And so they and they took a real interest in the house.
Do you think I'd be able to find some of those first AGM curtains?
I think they might have gone
Disappeared.
the way of all things.
So you were also a council member of part of International House. What led you to be part of that?
Well, there's that name again, Mavis
Jackson.
Jackson. You see, I'm in her slipstream, it sometimes seemed to me, that she was on the council and was about to become the first woman chair of the council. And she suggested to me that it would be a good idea for me to join the council. So they kindly asked me to do that. And I had, yes, several years um, with on council, most of which was in Mavis's time, and that was nice too. I'd kept up over the years my contact with the house, and well, right from the beginning, perhaps the first Café International, I was there. There was a regular, for years, a regular luncheon, Christmas luncheon that the women ran as a money-raising thing. And so what happened was the women made the food at home, or some of it was the food was brought in and they cooked it in the house kitchens. Well, that's, of course, today a complete no-no. And so, yes, they brought in the food themselves. They brought raffle tickets on the way in. They'd paid for themselves to go, plus probably a friend or two. And then, yes, they'd brought the raffle tickets, and then they went home holding things that from the stalls, a couple of stalls that some of the women had made. Yes, it was. They were really something else, those women. The whole thing of fundraising in those days was different. You didn't have any rooms full of telephone canvassers or professional people who were money raisers. What you did have was, in the daily press, there were up to 6 pages, women's pages, and the social editresses of those papers were very influential, and it was very handy if you could get the ear of some of them and have your function that you're planning advertised, in the nicest way, talked about in one of the first of those 6 pages. So when we planned a function, we rang the social editresses of the Age and the Herald and the Sun, and probably the Women's Weekly and the Women's Day. They were all going then, and that was one of the main ways of getting publicity.
And what would you say some of your challenges or some of the International House's challenges when you were on council?
Well, there's always the worry of where the fees should be set, I think, and over the years there's been disagreements on that. We got, I think it was in my time that we got representation on the council from the students, which I was very keen on. I don't know that I can...
Wasn't you were first member in 72? Women joined the college in 1972, and I know that was one of Mavis Jackson's biggest drivers, that she always wanted a co-ed college. Had you heard the same thing?
Yes, but the interesting thing was when I was doing some research for this, I found that apart from that twofold purpose that we went over earlier, of the early idea of the house and what they wanted, right from the beginning nearly, we had it was stated that they would like, the preference would be for an equal number of male and female students. And well, of course, Melbourne University was not so keen on this, and it took till 1971, was it, or 72, for us to go co-ed, but we were still the first of the colleges around the Crescent to go co-ed.
That's a long time, 20 years of motivation just to try and get an equal standing of women.
Yes, that's true.
You've stayed long, you've had a long association with International House. What makes it so special that you have been a part of it for 65 years?
Well, I think it was a very worthwhile cause. It's very important. Education is important, but it's important to gather people together, and you hope that they will learn from each other rather than just the academic side. That it's good to have the melting pot that I mentioned of cultures together. Sorry, I was just thinking the other day. I spent a year in New York at International House in New York towards the end of the 50s, and I learnt that the land and the building for their International House were given by, it was the owner of Phelps Dodge, of the car firm, and John D. Rockefeller III, I think we were up to then. And they'd sort of, you thought, well, goodness, somebody comes along and says, there you are, there's some money, buy land on Manhattan. And somebody else says, well, here's money and build a building. And then I thought, well, that's the way the Americans do it. But our IH was the house that people built.
It was. It always has been. And is that why you've been around for so long, have special friendships?
Yes, well, I think so. That I've kept up the interest because it seemed such a worthwhile thing.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Lyndal. It's been wonderful hearing from you.
Oh, thank you for asking me.
Thank you.
See you at the house.
Bye-bye.